Hey everyone, I hope your 2022 is off to a fantastic start so far. Today I'm going to be answering two small questions submitted by viewers which relate to bishops and bishop pins. The first question was part of a game submitted by Anish 10, and it was an e4-e5 game where the question was, where do I put my light squared bishop after h3 has been played? I'll show you that specific position in a moment, but let's first just look at the general principles by flipping the question and asking, as white, where do I put my dark squared bishop after my opponent plays pawn to h6. If you want to complete your development and move your bishop, you have limited options. Bishop takes h6 is a sacrifice that is unfortunately overly ambitious because after the pawn captures your bishop and you're now down material, you don't have enough pieces ready to swing in and conduct a mating attack. Similarly, bishop to g5 or bishop to f4 places our bishop on a square that is attacked and not defended, so we definitely want to avoid that as well. We're now down to two options if we want to move our bishop to d2 and bishop to e3. Bishop to e3 is a move that a lot of beginner players would probably disregard because they think after bishop captures we get doubled pawns, and you're often told that double pawns are bad. Double pawns are not always bad though. Over here we've now moved one of our pawns towards the center, so we now have 3 pawns in the center, and our pawn in the center on e3 might even be supporting a future d4 push when it's safe to do so, because you can imagine a dream situation where if your opponent captures back, you capture with your pawn and you end up with some very nice central pawns. Another thing that's nice over here is your rook has now got an open f-file once the f-pawn has moved across, and that could help you with a future attack. Possibly you're going to have play along the f-file, maybe targeting the f7 pawn. Maybe you can sacrifice your rook on f6 in future if you get an attack going and your other pieces are ready to spring in and checkmate the king. But also maybe you find out that you're able to do a rook lift and swing it across, none of which you're able to do if you have the pawn still blocking you in on f2. So that's what happens if our opponent captures us, but they don't have to capture us. One thing that beginner players do quite frequently is if they notice that their bishop is being attacked, they defend it with a pawn. So pawn to d6 is a move that quite often will happen in these positions. This is great for us though because we take the bishop, and after they take back, they have doubled pawns, but it's bad. The reason this is not as good as our double pawns were is because this pawn is now moving away from the center, and it's also not taking advantage of an open file for our rook. And a further drawback is that this e5 pawn is now no longer being defended by the pawn on d6, so that might become weak in future. So something that's a little bit common at a higher level is a lot of your opponents will end up going bishop to b6. The idea over here once again relates to doubled pawns being not as bad and getting open files for the pieces. So pawn takes on b6, which is taking towards the center, and you're also getting an open file for your rook, so your rook is actually developed on its starting position. We don't have to take though, and even just by putting our bishop on e3 and leaving their bishop on b6, we are busy decreasing the power of our opponent's dark squared bishop, because previously the bishop was busy pinning the f2 pawn, it was also possibly contributing towards a future attack on the king, whereas now it's challenged by our own bishop and we have nothing to worry about. So all in all, bishop to e3 is not a bad move, and it shouldn't be avoided just because it gives you doubled pawns. If you'd prefer a quieter position, if we go back to our starting position, bishop to d2 is an option. It develops your bishop by getting it off of the bank rank so that you can connect your rooks in future, and it doesn't do much other than that, so it is quite passive. You'll have to get it into the game later, but it might also be defending your knight on c3, and the important thing is that you have developed your pieces. Some of you here might be tempted to, instead of putting your bishop on d2, aim to try and fianchetto the bishop by getting it to b2 so that maybe it can play along this diagonal. In this specific position, I would caution against a move like b3 because you can see now your bishop has nowhere to go back to, and there's always a chance you might forget about it and end up having your bishop getting trapped. And then another issue is that if we try to fianchetto our bishop with a3 and b4, we can start off with a3, but our opponent can stop us from going b4 by playing pawn to a5. Another consideration to keep in mind is that if you ever push your b pawn, you might end up getting into some trouble along this diagonal if you're not careful. So these are the general principles of where you can put your bishop, the types of things that you should be taking into consideration when deciding where to put your pieces, and how to respond when your opponent attacks your own pieces. And let's quickly look at the specific position from Anish's game. Black has just played d6 and white has hopped the knight onto d5. So the question now is, where do we put our light squared bishop, because we would like to go to g4 but we can't because it's attacked by a pawn. Knowing all of the general principles, you can see bishop to e6 is quite a nice move over here. developing your bishop, and if your opponent takes the knight, you can capture with the queen, and now you're threatening to take the bishop, you're busy challenging the bishop so that you're not worried about any pins of the f-pawn, and if they capture, you could even, if you don't like the whole idea of doubled pawns, you could even capture back with your queen, and now you're all good, all safe, and you've got rid of your undeveloped bishop on c8 for your opponent's much more active bishop that was sitting on c4. If you're finding this video helpful so far, I'd appreciate it if you give it a like to help it spread to more people, and you can let me know in the comments if you prefer a knight or a bishop. Most people seem to have a preference, but I'm still on the fence about which ones I prefer. The second question was a YouTube comment from Captain Feathersword about the annoying pin that happens when you haven't played h3 as white, and what you should do about it, since if you play h3 over here, the bishop can just go back, and you now can't go g4 to break the pin, because it tends to weaken your king a little bit, and sometimes your opponent can even sacrifice and get a winning attack. One way to avoid this entirely is to go h3 before your opponent can go bishop to g4. Another option is to hold our bishop back, so that if the bishop goes to g4, we're then able to go bishop to e2 to break the pin. Alternatively, if you keep your knight back, then you might be able to go knight b to d2 in order to defend the knight, so that your queen is now free to move out of the pin, and then if the bishop takes, you can capture back with the knight. Something that's also an option along the same kind of idea is if you're able to lift the queen, let's say to d3 if there wasn't a pawn there, you're then still defending the knight, but you're getting out of the pin so that you can move the knight. And that's another option to avoid having a situation where if you just move the queen, they take, you have to take back to avoid losing a piece, and now you're going to probably be attacked because the g-file is open to your king. So your options are to play h3 before your opponent's bishop goes there, to try and break the pin with a bishop, or to use a knight or a queen or sometimes a rook to try and defend the knight so that you can move your queen out of the pin and then your knight is free to move again. These are all just general suggestions, and some of them are impossible or awkward in the specific lines that I've shown on the board, but a lot of the options that are available to you will depend on the opening that you end up playing. If you find that you play a game and there's an annoying pin that you couldn't get rid of, review the game afterwards and see what you could have done differently so that you could have used one of the options that I've just given you. As you do this more and more, you'll be able to adapt the openings you play and avoid the pins if they are busy frustrating you. As two further notes, for lower rated players, Chessbrah suggests that if a knight or a bishop goes to g4, g5, and they also say b4, b5, but we'll focus on the king side, they say you should attack it immediately with a pawn. I agree with this advice because, first of all, if you go h3, there's always the option that either your opponent moves their bishop back, or that they just remove the pin entirely. And if they don't do that and they do go bishop to h5, then you've got yourself a free move with a pawn, which gives your king an escape square, and you probably won't get back rank mated, assuming you're still a little bit careful. And a second note is that even though pins can be annoying, you don't always have to worry about it. As long as your opponent isn't able to add extra pressure to the pin by playing something like knight to d4 or queen to f6, so that after they capture you'll have to take back with the pawn and weaken your king, you might not have to worry about it. You just have to remember that you can't move your knight because then you're going to lose your queen. This specific position is a place where you do have to worry because black is threatening to go knight to d4, putting the knight and the bishop on your knight, and you can't drop back with the bishop, you can't defend this again. So this is a situation which you don't really want to get into, and you'll want to go and review your game and see what you could have done differently. But in other cases, the pin is nothing to worry about, it's just mildly annoying. I hope this video has helped you a bit with knowing where to put your bishops and how to deal with pins. If you want to sharpen some other areas of your chess too, you should check out this video over here. Thank you very much for watching, and happy chessing!